April 12, 1945. 0830 hours. Field Hospital. Converted Stalag 12. A compound. Limburg, Germany. Oberstarzt Dr. Wilhelm Bauer pressed his stethoscope against the American soldier's chest and heard the wet rattle of fluid in the lungs. Pneumonia, advanced. In the cot beside him, another American with a shattered femur and the unmistakable smell of gas gangrene spreading from the wound. In the third bed, an unconscious GI with septicemia so severe his temperature had spiked to 105 degrees. All three would be dead within days. Bauer had seen it 1,000 times in 4 years of war. The pneumonia patient might survive if his lungs were strong, but the gangrene case was hopeless. Gas gangrene killed faster than anything except a bullet to the brain. The septicemia patient had perhaps 48 hours before the infection overwhelmed his system completely. Dr. Bauer, Captain James Morrison of the U.S. Army Medical Corps, appeared at his elbow. The American surgeon who'd been assigned to supervise the captured German medical staff spoke decent German with a slight accent. "These three need immediate penicillin treatment. I'll show you the dosing protocol." Bauer straightened, maintaining his professional dignity despite wearing the remnants of his Wehrmacht uniform, with the rank insignia removed. "Herr Hauptmann, with respect, penicillin will do nothing for these cases. The gangrene is too advanced. Amputation might save him, though infection will likely—" "We're not amputating." Morrison's voice was matter-of-fact, not argumentative. "Watch." The American surgeon drew a syringe from a metal case and filled it with a yellow-brown liquid from a small vial. The label read Penicillin G, 100,000 units. Morrison injected the contents directly into the gangrene patient's arm, then repeated the procedure with the pneumonia and septicemia cases. "Every 4 hours," Morrison explained, "around the clock, the gangrene case gets 200,000 units per dose. Pneumonia gets 100,000. Septicemia gets 300,000. We'll reassess in 48 hours. Bauer watched this performance with professional skepticism. He'd heard rumors about American wonder drugs, of course. German intelligence had reported something called penicillin being used by Allied forces. But the descriptions seemed fantastical, propaganda designed to demoralize German medical personnel. No drug could stop gas gangrene once it had taken hold. The bacteria producing the gas were anaerobic, thriving in dead tissue beyond the reach of sulfa drugs or any other antimicrobial. "Herr Hauptmann, I've been a surgeon for 12 years. Gas gangrene requires immediate amputation or the patient dies. Always. There are no exceptions to this medical reality." Morrison smiled slightly. "Come back in 3 days, Dr. Bauer. Then tell me about medical reality." What Bauer didn't know, what no German medical officer fully understood despite fragmentary intelligence reports, was that the Americans had won the war before a single shot was fired on D-Day. They had won it in laboratories in Oxford, in fermentation tanks in Peoria, Illinois, in pharmaceutical factories that produced antibiotics in quantities that made German attempts look like medieval alchemy. The mathematics of survival were already written in those yellow-brown vials, and they would save more Allied lives than any weapon in the American arsenal. 3 days later, Bauer returned to the ward as ordered. The American with gangrene was sitting up in bed, eating from a metal tray. The wound on his leg, which had been black and necrotic, was now pink tissue with healthy granulation. The smell of gas gangrene had vanished, replaced by the ordinary hospital smell of antiseptic and clean bandages. The pneumonia patient was breathing normally, his lungs clear. The septicemia case was conscious, talking to a nurse, his temperature normal. Bauer stood frozen, staring at men who should have been in the morgue. His medical training, his 12 years of experience, his certainty about the limits of what surgery could accomplish. All of it crumbled in the face of 3 soldiers who had been dying and were now recovering. "Impossible," he whispered in German. Morrison appeared beside him. "Not impossible. Penicillin. We've been using it since 1943. These results are routine for us now." Routine. Bauer's voice was hollow. He thought of the soldiers he'd watched die in Russia, in North Africa, in France. Men who'd survived the initial trauma only to die days later from infections that consumed them cell by cell. Boys he'd amputated, taking legs and arms to save lives, leaving them crippled. Officers who'd begged him to do something, anything, while septicemia turned their blood to poison. All of them could have been saved by this yellow liquid the Americans produced in such quantities they used it routinely. Morrison seemed to read his thoughts. "How many German soldiers died from infections that penicillin could have prevented?" Bauer didn't answer. He couldn't. The number was too large, too terrible to calculate. He'd served in field hospitals since 1941. He'd watched hundreds die from infections, thousands, perhaps. And this entire time, the Americans had possessed a drug that could have saved them. Why? The question escaped before he could stop it. Why didn't Germany develop this? Germany tried. Morrison pulled a chair over and sat down, gesturing for Bauer to join him. The American lit a cigarette and offered one to the German doctor, who took it with trembling fingers. "Your pharmaceutical companies knew about penicillin. Fleming published his discovery in 1929. It was public knowledge. The problem wasn't knowledge. It was production." Production. Bauer exhaled smoke, thinking. Of course. Everything in this war came down to production. German tanks were better than American tanks individually, but America built 50 for every one Germany made. German pilots were better trained, but America graduated more pilots than Germany had aircraft. Why should medicine be different? Morrison continued. Britain couldn't produce enough penicillin alone, so they shared the technology with us in 1941. We built 21 pharmaceutical plants dedicated to penicillin production. By D-Day, we manufactured 2.3 million doses for the invasion. By war's end, we'll have produced over 650 billion units. The numbers were incomprehensible. Bauer had seen the weekly medical supply requisitions for an entire Wehrmacht division. They received perhaps 2,000 units of sulfa drugs when available, often less. The Americans were producing billions. German pharmaceutical companies attempted penicillin production, Bauer said quietly. I heard rumors. IG Farben had a program. They did. It failed. Production yielded negligible quantities. Not because German scientists were incompetent, but because producing penicillin at scale requires industrial capacity and resources Germany didn't have by 1943. Morrison stubbed out his cigarette. You were trying to win a medical war with 1930s technology while we brought 1940s industrial capacity to bear. Over the following weeks, Bauer worked alongside American medical personnel in the converted POW camp hospital. He watched the penicillin miracle repeat itself daily. Wounded soldiers arrived with infections that would have meant certain death in German hospitals. They received injections every 4 hours. Within days, they were recovering. Within weeks, they were walking. The gangrene cases particularly haunted him. In the Wehrmacht, gas gangrene meant immediate amputation if the surgeon was lucky enough to catch it early. Usually, it meant death. The Americans saved nearly everyone. They still amputated sometimes when tissue damage was too severe, but they saved the patient's life with casual certainty. We used to lose 15% of wounded to infection in World War I. An American doctor named Captain Robert Chen explained during a surgical consultation. In this war, we're losing less than 4%. Penicillin is the difference. Bauer thought of the German casualty statistics he'd seen. Infection rates remained stubbornly high throughout the war. Pneumonia killed thousands. Septicemia was a death sentence. Gas gangrene mortality approached 100%. The Wehrmacht medical service fought with the same tools they'd used in the previous war: surgical skill, sulfa drugs when available, and desperate hope. The Americans fought with penicillin and won every time. One afternoon, Bauer was assisting with a complicated abdominal surgery on a German POW with peritonitis from a perforated bowel. The patient should have died from septic shock within hours. But Morrison flooded the abdominal cavity with penicillin solution before closing, then started the patient on intramuscular injections. "He'll recover," Morrison said with absolute confidence. "How can you be certain?" Bauer demanded. "Peritonitis kills almost everyone. Used to kill almost everyone. With penicillin, survival rate is over 90%. Morrison stripped off his surgical gloves. "Dr. Bauer, you're an excellent surgeon. Your technique is as good as anyone I've worked with. But surgical skill doesn't matter when the patient dies from infection 3 days later. We're not better surgeons than you. We just have better drugs." The words cut deeper than any scalpel. Bauer had trained for years to perfect his surgical technique. He'd studied anatomy, practiced suturing until his hands cramped, learned to operate under battlefield conditions with artillery shells falling nearby. He'd taken pride in his skill, in his ability to save lives through precision and knowledge. And none of it mattered. A bottle of yellow liquid was more valuable than 12 years of surgical experience. That night, Bauer wrote in his private diary, a practice he'd maintained throughout the war despite regulations against it. "Today I watched the Americans perform a miracle I would have thought impossible. They saved a man with peritonitis using a drug I've only heard rumors about. If Germany had possessed this penicillin in 1941, how many of my patients would still be alive? How many boys would have kept their arms and legs? How many mothers would have welcomed sons home instead of receiving death notifications?" The Americans haven't just won the war through superior tanks and aircraft. They've won it through superior chemistry. They save their soldiers while ours die from infections that are apparently preventable. This isn't medicine. This is industrial warfare applied to biology. They manufacture survival the same way they manufacture bullets, in overwhelming quantities that make our efforts look primitive. I've been a doctor for 12 years. I've prided myself on skill and knowledge. Today, I learned that I've been practicing medicine while the Americans practice something beyond medicine. They've industrialized healing, and we never even knew it was possible. The statistical reality was devastating. Among Allied forces treated with penicillin, mortality from bacterial infections dropped to nearly zero. German forces relying on sulfa drugs and traditional surgical interventions continued dying at rates that would have been familiar to surgeons in 1918. The disparity extended beyond battlefield casualties. Pneumonia, which had killed 17,000 American soldiers in World War I, killed only 70 in World War II before March 1945. The difference was entirely due to penicillin. Venereal disease, particularly syphilis, had crippled military effectiveness in previous wars. Penicillin cured it in days. Septicemia, which killed more wounded soldiers than bullets in World War I, became survivable with penicillin treatment. The Americans had achieved something the Germans hadn't even attempted. They'd industrialized medicine. They'd taken a laboratory discovery and, through massive investment and pharmaceutical industry coordination, turned it into a weapon that saved lives at the same scale factories produced weapons that took lives. Bauer began to understand that Germany had lost the medical war the same way it had lost the industrial war, not through lack of scientific knowledge, but through inability to translate knowledge into mass production. German chemists understood antibiotics. German pharmaceutical companies like IG Farben had tried to manufacture penicillin, but they lacked the industrial capacity, the resources, and the organizational coordination to succeed. The Americans, characteristically, had approached the problem like building an aircraft carrier. They'd mobilized multiple companies, shared research freely, invested billions, and produced enough penicillin to treat every wounded soldier. They'd treated medicine as a logistics problem and solved it with industrial methods. Standing in that converted POW camp hospital, watching American doctors save soldiers with routine efficiency, Bauer understood that Germany had been fighting a 20th century war with 19th century medicine. The Americans had brought pharmaceutical manufacturing to warfare, and the results were as decisive as air superiority or armor supremacy. The yellow liquid in those small vials represented something profound. Proof that American industrial culture could be applied to any problem, even biological ones. They didn't just build more tanks, they built better medicine. And they did it at a scale that made German efforts look like medieval alchemy. Bauer would survive the war, return to practice in Hamburg, and spend the rest of his life thinking about those 3 American soldiers who should have died but lived. Every surgical technique he'd mastered, every procedure he'd perfected, every year of training, all of it had been rendered obsolete by American industrial chemistry. The Americans hadn't just won through military superiority. They'd won by keeping their soldiers alive long enough to continue fighting. And Germany, for all its vaunted scientific tradition and medical excellence, had never even understood the battle was happening until American penicillin was already saving enemy lives in quantities German doctors could barely imagine. The miracle that Dr. Bauer witnessed in April 1945 had begun 16 years earlier, in a cluttered laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital in London. On September 3, 1929, Alexander Fleming returned from vacation to find something unexpected growing in a petri dish he'd left on his bench. A blue-green mold had contaminated his bacterial culture, and around the mold, the bacteria had died. Fleming was enough of a scientist to recognize something unusual when he saw it. Most researchers would have discarded the contaminated dish. Fleming instead studied it, isolated the mold, and published a paper in 1929 describing a substance he called penicillin that killed bacteria. The paper appeared in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology. Few people read it. Fewer understood its significance. Fleming himself couldn't purify penicillin in sufficient quantities to test it medically. The mold produced only tiny amounts of the active compound, and his attempts to concentrate it failed. By 1931, he'd essentially abandoned the work. Penicillin remained a laboratory curiosity, mentioned occasionally in scientific literature, ignored by the medical establishment. For 10 years, Fleming's discovery gathered dust in journals while soldiers continued dying from infected wounds at rates that would have been familiar to surgeons in Napoleon's army. Then, in 1939, as Europe descended into war, Howard Florey, an Australian pathologist at Oxford University, was searching for research projects. His colleague Ernst Chain, a Jewish biochemist who'd fled Nazi Germany in 1933, suggested investigating antibacterial substances. Chain had read Fleming's 1929 paper and thought it promising. What Florey and Chain accomplished over the next 2 years represented scientific achievement under impossible circumstances. With Britain at war, resources were scarce, laboratories were disrupted, and many scientists had been diverted to military projects. Florey's team worked in makeshift conditions, growing penicillin mold in every container they could find: bedpans, ceramic vessels, even bathroom fixtures. They employed young women called penicillin girls at £2 per week to monitor the fermentation process. By 1940, they had produced enough purified penicillin to test on mice. 8 mice were infected with deadly bacteria. 4 received penicillin. Those 4 survived. The other 4 died. The results were unambiguous. Human trials began in February 1941. Albert Alexander, a 43-year-old policeman, lay dying at Radcliffe Infirmary from septicemia caused by a scratch from a rose thorn. His face was covered in abscesses. His lungs were failing. Doctors gave him days to live. Florey's team began injecting him with their precious penicillin supply. They had produced only a few grams through weeks of painstaking work. Within 24 hours, Alexander's fever dropped. His abscesses began healing. After 5 days, he was sitting up, eating, talking. The doctors were witnessing a genuine medical miracle. Then the penicillin ran out. The team had been recycling it from Alexander's urine, repurifying and re-injecting it, but they simply didn't have enough. Without continued treatment, the infection returned. Alexander died on March 15, 1941. The tragedy demonstrated both penicillin's potential and the fundamental problem: production. Florey's team could save lives if they had enough penicillin. They couldn't produce enough penicillin working in laboratory conditions with improvised equipment. Britain in 1941 was fighting for survival. German bombers attacked nightly. Resources were stretched to breaking. British pharmaceutical companies were already operating at capacity, producing conventional medicines and military supplies. No one had the industrial capacity to scale up penicillin production while the war raged. Florey made a decision that would save millions of lives. In July 1941, he and Norman Heatley flew to America, carrying with them samples of the penicillium mold and detailed notes on their purification methods. They met with officials at the Rockefeller Foundation, who arranged meetings with pharmaceutical companies and government agencies. The Americans responded with characteristic enthusiasm and industrial ambition. Dr. Percy Wells at the Department of Agriculture's Northern Regional Research Laboratory in Peoria, Illinois, immediately grasped what Florey was describing. This wasn't just a scientific curiosity. This was a drug that could save thousands of wounded soldiers, and saving soldiers required industrial-scale production. The Peoria laboratory began searching for better strains of penicillin-producing mold. Lab assistant Mary Hunt scoured local markets, examining moldy fruits and vegetables. In 1943, she found a cantaloupe covered in golden mold at a Peoria market. That moldy melon contained a penicillium strain that produced 200 times more penicillin than Fleming's original culture. Simultaneously, researchers discovered that corn steep liquor, a waste product from corn processing, abundant in the Midwest, was the perfect nutrient for growing penicillin. The mold that had been temperamental and slow-growing in Oxford laboratories thrived in American corn-based media. But the real revolution came from deep tank fermentation. Traditional methods grew penicillin mold on the surface of liquid media in shallow containers, requiring enormous space and producing minimal yields. American chemical engineers adapted fermentation tanks used for brewing and chemical production, creating 10,000-gallon tanks where penicillin mold could grow throughout the entire volume of liquid, constantly aerated and agitated. Charles Pfizer and Company, a pharmaceutical firm in Brooklyn, had been producing citric acid using fermentation tanks for years. They immediately saw how to adapt their facilities. By March 1944, Pfizer had converted their Brooklyn plant, installing 14 massive fermentation tanks, each holding 7,500 gallons. Merck, Squibb, and other companies followed with their own facilities. The scale of American production shocked even the Americans themselves. In 1942, American pharmaceutical companies produced enough penicillin to treat perhaps 100 patients. In 1943, production reached 21 billion units, enough for tens of thousands. By 1944, American factories were producing 650 billion units monthly, enough to treat every wounded Allied soldier multiple times. The coordination required was unprecedented. The War Production Board took direct control in 1943, designating 21 pharmaceutical companies to participate. The Office of Scientific Research and Development coordinated research, sharing findings freely among companies that normally competed. Patents were pooled. Production methods were standardized. Quality control protocols were developed and enforced. It was industrial mobilization applied to pharmaceutical manufacturing, treating medicine as a strategic resource equivalent to aircraft or ammunition. And it worked with devastating effectiveness. Germany watched these developments with growing alarm and mounting frustration. German intelligence obtained samples of Allied penicillin as early as 1943 from captured medical supplies. Chemical analysis revealed the structure. German pharmaceutical companies, particularly IG Farben, understood exactly what penicillin was and how valuable it could be. IG Farben attempted production at several facilities. The results were pathetic compared to American output. By 1945, German penicillin production totaled perhaps 10 to 20 kilograms for the entire war, enough to treat a few hundred patients. The Americans were producing tons. The reasons for German failure were multiple and damning. German pharmaceutical tradition emphasized small batch, high-purity production using classical methods. The Americans had abandoned purity standards, accepting good enough penicillin that could be produced in massive quantities. German companies lacked the fermentation expertise that American chemical and brewing companies possessed. Most critically, Germany by 1943 faced strategic bombing that disrupted every industrial sector, chronic resource shortages, and collapsing transportation networks. But beyond practical difficulties lay a philosophical failure. German medical culture emphasized individual physician skill and pharmaceutical precision. The idea of treating antibiotics as a commodity to be manufactured in overwhelming quantities, accepting some impurity and variation in exchange for scale, was culturally foreign. Germans built precise equipment for small-scale production. Americans built big tanks and worried about precision later. The statistical results were undeniable. By D-Day, American forces had stockpiled 2.3 million doses of penicillin. Every medical unit carried supplies. Every field hospital maintained reserves. Soldiers knew that if they were wounded, they would receive penicillin treatment as routinely as they received bandages. German soldiers knew that if they were wounded severely enough to develop infection, they would probably die. Sulfa drugs helped sometimes. Surgical skill saved some. But infection remained the second leading cause of death after direct combat trauma throughout the war for German forces. The impact on survival rates was measurable and devastating. Among American soldiers hospitalized for wounds in Europe between D-Day and German surrender, mortality was 3.9%. In World War I, the rate had been 8%. The difference was almost entirely attributable to penicillin. Gas gangrene, the terror of battlefield medicine since the invention of gunpowder, was effectively neutralized. American forces reported 1.5 cases per 1,000 wounded. German forces reported 20 to 30 per 1,000, and German cases almost always resulted in amputation or death, while American cases usually recovered with limbs intact. Pneumonia, which had killed 17,000 American soldiers in 18 months during World War I, killed 70 Americans in the entire European theater through March 1945. The disease hadn't become less deadly. The treatment had become infinitely more effective. The price differential told its own story. In 1943, penicillin cost $20 per dose, expensive but manageable for the U.S. military budget. By 1945, mass production had driven the price to $0.55 per dose. The Americans were producing life-saving medicine cheaper than Germany could manufacture aspirin. German doctors working with captured penicillin supplies reported results that bordered on miraculous. But supplies were so limited they could only treat the most critical cases, rationing a drug that Americans used freely. The irony was crushing. German medical science understood penicillin perfectly. German industrial capacity simply couldn't produce it. One captured German medical officer, interviewed in 1945, summed up the situation with bitter clarity. "We had the best surgeons in the world. The Americans had penicillin. In modern warfare, industrial chemistry beats surgical skill. We were fighting with 1918 medicine against 1945 medicine, and our soldiers paid with their lives." The collaboration between British science and American industry represented warfare's future. Britain provided the scientific breakthrough. America provided the industrial capacity to manufacture it at scale. Together, they created a pharmaceutical advantage as decisive as air superiority. By war's end, penicillin had saved an estimated 100,000 Allied soldiers who would have died from infections. That conservative estimate didn't count the thousands whose wounds healed faster, who avoided amputations, who recovered from pneumonia and septicemia that would have been fatal without antibiotic treatment. The revolution extended beyond battlefield medicine. Venereal disease, particularly syphilis, had compromised military effectiveness in every previous war. Soldiers spent months in treatment. Many suffered permanent damage. Penicillin cured syphilis in days, returning soldiers to duty almost immediately. The German response to VD remained tied to traditional treatments: mercury compounds, arsenic derivatives, treatments that were toxic and often ineffective. American soldiers received penicillin shots and were back on duty within a week. The difference in man-hours lost to disease was staggering. American military planners had understood from the beginning that keeping soldiers alive meant keeping armies in the field. They invested in medical research with the same enthusiasm they invested in tank production. Penicillin was one result. Blood plasma, sulfa drugs for situations where penicillin wasn't available, portable X-ray machines, improved surgical techniques, all were developed and deployed at scale. Germany invested in military technology, better tanks, jet aircraft, V-weapons. These investments produced technical marvels that arrived too late and in insufficient quantities. American investment in medical technology produced penicillin that arrived in time and in overwhelming quantities, and it saved more lives than wonder weapons could take. The yellow liquid in those small vials represented American industrial philosophy applied to medicine. Where Germans saw penicillin as a pharmaceutical challenge requiring precise chemistry, Americans saw a production problem requiring industrial methods. Where Germans attempted to produce perfect penicillin in small quantities, Americans produced good enough penicillin in massive quantities. And on battlefields across Europe and the Pacific, American soldiers lived while their opponents died from infections that were entirely preventable. The miracle drug had been distributed so widely that soldiers almost took it for granted. They expected to survive wounds that would have killed their fathers in the previous war. And they did survive, in percentages that would have seemed impossible 20 years earlier. Dr. Bauer, watching American doctors save German POWs with casual efficiency, was witnessing the culmination of a pharmaceutical revolution that had begun in a contaminated petri dish and ended in fermentation tanks producing tons of antibiotics. The path from Fleming's discovery to industrial production had taken 16 years, billions of dollars, and the coordinated efforts of dozens of companies and hundreds of scientists. Germany had never even started down that path, and German soldiers had died by the thousands as a result. December 18th, 1944. 0340 hours. Feld Lazaret, 27, 15 kilometers southeast of Bastogne, Belgium. Dr. Wilhelm Bauer pressed his palm against Gefreiter Heinz Müller's forehead and felt the fever burning through the young soldier's skin. 104 degrees, maybe higher. Müller had been wounded 3 days ago during the opening hours of the Ardennes offensive. A shell fragment through his left thigh, clean entry and exit. Bauer had operated immediately, debriding the wound, removing bone fragments, suturing muscle and fascia with meticulous care. The surgery had gone perfectly. Now Müller was dying. Herr Oberstarzt, the young soldier's voice was barely a whisper. My leg. It feels strange. Bauer pulled back the blanket and unwrapped the dressing. The smell hit him immediately, the distinctive, sweet, rotten odor of gas gangrene. The wound edges had turned black. The surrounding tissue was gray-green, swollen, crepitant, with gas bubbles that crackled under his fingers. Müller's femoral artery throbbed visibly beneath skin that looked like rotting meat. Scheiße, Bauer breathed. He'd seen this 100 times. Gas gangrene moved with terrifying speed, producing toxins that destroyed tissue faster than any surgeon could cut. Once established, it was a death sentence unless caught immediately, and Müller's infection was already advanced. We need to operate, Bauer called to his surgical assistant, Sanitätsfeldwebel Otto Krebs. Prepare for amputation, high thigh, above the infection margin. Herr Oberstarzt, we have 6 other critical cases waiting. Krebs gestured toward the surgery tent where wounded soldiers from the offensive lay on litters, bleeding, screaming, dying. The supply convoy was destroyed by American aircraft. We have almost no morphine, no plasma, barely enough sutures. This boy dies in 2 hours if I don't amputate, Bauer interrupted. Get him prepped. Use what morphine we have. Müller's eyes went wide with comprehension and terror. My leg? You're taking my leg? Bauer gripped the soldier's shoulder. The infection is spreading. If I don't amputate above it, the gangrene will kill you. With amputation, you have a chance. How much chance? Bauer hesitated. The truth was brutal. Even with amputation, gas gangrene patients died 60% of the time from toxins already in their bloodstream. Without adequate morphine for the amputation, Müller would experience agony that would compromise his survival. Without plasma to replace blood loss, Shock would kill him. Without antibiotics to fight the spreading infection, septicemia would finish what the gangrene started. A fighting chance, Bauer lied. You're strong, Heinz. You'll survive this. 30 minutes later, Bauer was cutting through Muller's femur with a bone saw, while the boy screamed despite the inadequate morphine. Krebs held him down, talking constantly in a low voice about Muller's home in Bavaria, his mother's cooking, anything to distract from the surgery. The sound of the saw cutting bone was distinctive and terrible. Bauer worked with desperate speed, ligating blood vessels, cutting through muscle groups, severing the sciatic nerve as high as possible to minimize phantom limb pain. Muller's leg came away in his hands, a useless piece of meat that had been a functioning limb 36 hours ago. He dropped it in the bucket and began closing the stump, but even as he sutured, he could see the tissue wasn't healthy. The infection had spread into muscle above where he'd cut. He'd have to go higher. I need to take more, Bauer said quietly to Krebs. Muller, semi-conscious from morphine and pain, heard him. No, please, no more. We don't have a choice. Then let me die. Muller's voice broke. I'm 19 years old. I'm already crippled. Don't make it worse. Bauer looked at the boy's face, pale, streaked with tears, twisted in agony, and made a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. Give him more morphine. Make him comfortable. There's nothing else I can do. He walked away from the surgery table, stripping off blood-soaked gloves, leaving Krebs to dress the stump that wouldn't save the boy's life. Muller would be dead by morning. Gas gangrene would spread into his pelvis, producing toxins that would shut down his kidneys and stop his heart. And Bauer, for all his surgical skill and 12 years of training, was powerless to prevent it. The surgery tent held 11 other wounded soldiers. Bauer moved among them with growing despair, performing triage that felt more like selecting who would die first. An Obergefreiter with a sucking chest wound who was drowning in his own blood. Bauer could operate, but without plasma or whole blood for transfusion, the man would die from shock before the surgery ended. A lieutenant with a shattered humerus and obvious signs of infection setting in. Even if Bauer could save the arm, the infection would likely turn septic. A Stabsfeld-Weibel with a penetrating abdominal wound who was probably bleeding internally. Without adequate surgical supplies or post-operative care, peritonitis would kill him within days. Herr Oberstarzt, Krebs appeared at his elbow. The supply situation. We're almost out of antiseptic. The sulfa powder is gone. We have perhaps 20 ampules of morphine remaining. The surgical pack is down to 2 scalpels and we're sterilizing sutures for reuse. Bauer closed his eyes. This was the reality of German military medicine in December 1944. Factories bombed into rubble, supply lines severed, resources diverted to the offensive, and soldiers dying from infections that proper medicine could prevent. Do what you can, Bauer said. Prioritize the ones who might survive. The words tasted like ash. He was a doctor. His oath was to preserve life. Instead, he was deciding who would receive the mercy of dying quickly versus slowly. Throughout the night, Bauer operated under impossible conditions. He set bones without adequate splinting materials. He closed wounds without enough sutures, improvising with whatever he could find. He treated shock without plasma. He fought infections without antibiotics. And he watched soldiers die despite his best efforts. At 0620 hours, Gefreiter Müller stopped breathing. Bauer had been monitoring him hourly, helpless to do anything but watch the gangrene spread. The boy's final hours had been agony, fever, delirium, the distinctive smell of his own body rotting from within. Morphine had helped, but they'd run out before the end. Muller died screaming for his mother. Krebs covered the boy's face with a blanket. 19 years old. 3 days ago he was walking. Now he's dead from a wound you could have fixed if we had proper supplies. I know, Bauer said quietly. How many? Krebs demanded. How many have we lost this week to infections? 30? 40? Boys who survived the initial trauma only to die because we don't have medicine that probably exists somewhere? Bauer had no answer. He'd heard rumors about American wonder drugs. Intelligence reports mentioned something called penicillin. But rumors did nothing for soldiers dying in field hospitals that lacked basic supplies. The Wehrmacht medical service was fighting 1944. Battles with 1918 medicine, and the casualty rate proved it. By dawn, 4 more soldiers had died. 2 from shock that plasma could have prevented. 1 from peritonitis following abdominal surgery. 1 from pneumonia that filled his lungs with fluid while Bauer listened helplessly to the death rattle. None of the deaths were from enemy action. All were from medical inadequacy. Herr Oberstarzt! A Sanitätsunteroffizier burst into the surgery tent. American forces are approaching from the west. Battalion is retreating. We have orders to evacuate the hospital immediately. Bauer looked at the wounded soldiers lying on litters. We can't move these men. Half of them won't survive transport. Orders are to take who we can and destroy medical supplies that can't be evacuated. The Americans will be here within the hour. The retreat was chaos. Bauer and his staff loaded ambulances with soldiers who could survive transport. 12 men from the 40 they'd been treating. The rest would have to be left behind with a skeleton medical crew who would surrender to American forces. Bauer made the terrible calculations quickly, designating 3 orderlies to stay with the wounded. Tell the Americans we left you to care for patients who couldn't be moved, Bauer instructed them. They'll respect medical personnel under Geneva Convention. Probably. As the ambulances pulled away, Bauer looked back at the field hospital he was abandoning. The surgery tent where he'd fought to save lives with inadequate tools. The ward tent where soldiers lay dying from infections that proper medicine could cure. The burial detail loading bodies onto carts for mass graves. The Wehrmacht was losing not just battles, but the capacity to care for its wounded. And Bauer, watching the hospital disappear behind him, understood that German soldiers were dying from something more insidious than enemy bullets. They were dying from industrial inadequacy, from a medical system that couldn't produce the supplies necessary for modern warfare. 3 days later, Bauer's ambulance convoy was surrounded by American forces near Saint-Vith. The Wehrmacht guards surrendered without firing a shot. Bauer expected to be separated from his medical supplies and sent to a POW camp. Instead, an American medical officer, Captain James Morrison, examined his credentials and made an unexpected offer. Dr. Bauer, we're establishing a field hospital at a captured German POW camp in Limburg. We need experienced surgeons to help with the overflow. You'll work under American supervision, treating American and German wounded. Interested? Bauer stared at him. You want a German military surgeon to treat American soldiers? I want a competent surgeon. I don't care what uniform you wore last week. Morrison lit a cigarette. We have more wounded than we can handle. You have surgical training we need. Simple transaction. That was how Bauer found himself at Stalag 12th, working alongside American medical personnel, watching them save lives with a casualness that seemed almost supernatural. The first case he observed, the 3 American soldiers who should have died but recovered with penicillin treatment, shattered his medical worldview completely. But the true horror came 3 weeks later, when a convoy of German POWs arrived from the Ardennes. Bauer recognized several soldiers from his own hospital. They'd been left behind when he evacuated, surrendered to American forces, and were now receiving treatment in American medical facilities. Obergefreiter Schultz! Bauer grabbed the arm of a soldier he'd operated on in December, a compound leg fracture with signs of infection developing. Bauer had expected the infection to turn gangrenous. He'd left Schultz behind, certain the boy would lose his leg or his life. Schultz looked up, recognized his former surgeon, and smiled. "Herr Oberstarzt, you survived. Your leg." Bauer gestured at the healing wound, perfectly clean, no sign of infection. "How?" "The Americans gave me injections every few hours. Some yellow medicine. The infection cleared up in 3 days." Schultz shrugged. "Their doctors said it was routine." Bauer examined the wound. The bone was setting properly. The tissue was healthy pink, granulating normally. This boy would walk again, possibly without even a limp. In German care, he would have lost the leg or died from septicemia. "Did they tell you what medicine they used?" "Penicillin," they said. "They use it for everything." That night, Bauer sat in the quarters assigned to German medical personnel and wrote a letter he knew would never be sent, addressed to the Wehrmacht Medical Service High Command, documenting what he'd witnessed. "I have spent 3 weeks observing American military medicine. The technical superiority is so overwhelming that comparison's meaningless. They possess a drug called penicillin that neutralizes bacterial infections with near-perfect effectiveness. Gas gangrene, septicemia, pneumonia, peritonitis. Conditions that mean death or amputation in our care are routinely cured in American hospitals. The soldiers I left behind in December, certain they would die or be crippled, have recovered under American treatment. Boys I would have amputated are walking. Men I would have declared hopeless are alive and healthy. This is not a difference in surgical technique. This is industrial superiority applied to medicine. The Americans manufacture survival the way they manufacture ammunition, in overwhelming quantities. While we ration sulfa drugs and watch soldiers die from infections, the Americans inject penicillin liberally and save nearly everyone. I have been a surgeon for 12 years. I believed skill and training were paramount. I was wrong. In modern warfare, industrial chemistry beats surgical excellence. We are fighting with 1918 medicine against 1945 pharmaceutical science. The casualty statistics prove it. How many German soldiers have died from infections that American penicillin could have cured? I cannot calculate the number. Thousands, certainly. Perhaps tens of thousands. And we had the scientific knowledge to produce penicillin. We simply lacked the industrial capacity and organization to manufacture it at scale. The Americans have won the medical war as decisively as they've won the industrial war. Our soldiers die while theirs survive, and there is no counter to it, no tactical adjustment, no amount of surgical skill that can overcome their pharmaceutical advantage. Bauer signed the letter, folded it, and burned it in the stove. There was no point sending it. The war was lost. Germany was collapsing, and the knowledge that thousands of soldiers had died from treatable infections wouldn't change anything. But standing in that American hospital, watching routine miracles performed with yellow liquid administered every 4 hours, Bauer understood the full measure of Germany's defeat. They hadn't just been outfought. They'd been outproduced, outsupplied, and outmedicated. American industrial capacity had been applied to every aspect of warfare, including the capacity to keep soldiers alive. And German medical science, for all its tradition and training, had been revealed as inadequate for modern warfare. They had skilled surgeons operating without adequate supplies. The Americans had adequate supplies administered by competent doctors. The outcome was never in doubt. Gefreiter Heinz Müller had died screaming in a German field hospital, killed by gas gangrene that spread because Bauer lacked antibiotics. Obergefreiter Schultz had recovered in an American POW hospital, saved by penicillin administered as routinely as bandages. That difference, between death and survival, between amputation and recovery, was the difference between German and American military medicine in 1944. And it was a difference measured not in surgical skill, but in industrial capacity to produce the drugs that kept soldiers alive. The pharmaceutical revolution that transformed European battlefield medicine reached the Pacific theater with equal impact, but under conditions that made penicillin even more critical. In the jungles of New Guinea, the mountains of Burma, and the coral atolls scattered across the Pacific, bacterial infections thrived in heat and humidity that turned every wound into a potential death sentence. Corpsman John Silva of the 1st Marine Division watched penicillin save lives on Peleliu in September 1944, under conditions that would have meant certain death 2 years earlier. A Marine with a sucking chest wound, the kind of injury that killed through infection even if the initial trauma was survivable, received immediate penicillin injections along with surgical repair. He survived. Another Marine with shrapnel wounds contaminated by coral dust and jungle mud, almost guaranteed septicemia in previous campaigns, received around-the-clock penicillin and walked off the island 3 weeks later. "We used to lose guys to infection constantly," Silva wrote in his diary. "Guadalcanal, Tarawa, every campaign, we'd patch guys up and watch them die from fever 5 days later. Now we shoot them full of penicillin and they recover. It's like having magic." The Pacific presented unique medical challenges. Wounds contaminated by coral produced infections that were particularly resistant to sulfa drugs. Tropical diseases, malaria, dengue, typhus, weakened soldiers and made them more vulnerable to bacterial infections. Heat and humidity created perfect conditions for bacteria to multiply in wounds. Japanese defensive tactics emphasized holding positions to the death, meaning battles lasted weeks in close quarters where disease spread rapidly. Penicillin addressed these challenges with startling effectiveness. The drug worked regardless of climate, remained stable in tropical heat, and killed bacteria that thrived in jungle environments. American forces fighting through the Pacific carried penicillin in quantities that would have seemed impossible in earlier wars. Every aid station stocked it. Every battalion surgeon had adequate supplies. Every corpsman carried emergency doses. The Japanese, facing identical medical challenges, had no equivalent. Their military medical system relied on sulfa drugs when available, traditional antiseptics, and surgical intervention. Japanese soldiers wounded in the fierce fighting on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa died from infections at rates approaching 40%, 4 times the American rate. Captain Hiroshi Nakamura, a Japanese army surgeon captured on Okinawa in June 1945, experienced the American medical advantage firsthand when he was assigned to help treat Japanese POWs. His first case was a Japanese soldier with gas gangrene, the same condition that had killed Gefreiter Müller in Bauer's German field hospital. In our medical service, this man would require immediate amputation or would die within hours, Nakamura told his American supervisor through an interpreter. Probably both, amputation followed by death from septic shock. The American surgeon injected penicillin, started IV fluids, and monitored the patient. 3 days later, the Japanese soldier was sitting up, eating, his wound healing cleanly. No amputation, no death. Just routine application of a drug the Japanese army didn't have. Nakamura's reaction mirrored Bauer's. He spent the rest of his captivity documenting American medical procedures with the meticulous detail of a man recording evidence of the impossible. Japanese military medicine had emphasized stoic endurance and acceptance of suffering. American medicine had emphasized industrial production of drugs that eliminated suffering. The philosophical gap was as wide as the industrial gap. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. Among American forces in the Pacific Theater from 1944 to 1945, infection-related deaths dropped to less than 2% of wounded, lower even than European rates. Despite worse conditions, Japanese forces suffered infection mortality approaching 35 to 40% of wounded. The 20-fold disparity wasn't due to superior American surgical skill. It was entirely attributable to penicillin. But perhaps penicillin's most significant military impact came from an unexpected direction: venereal disease. Throughout military history, VD had compromised more combat effectiveness than enemy action. In World War I, over 400,000 American soldiers required treatment for syphilis and gonorrhea, removing them from duty for months. Treatments were toxic: mercury compounds, arsenic derivatives, and often ineffective. Penicillin cured syphilis in days. By 1944, it was standard treatment throughout American forces. A soldier diagnosed with syphilis received injections for 7 to 10 days and returned to duty completely cured. The impact on military effectiveness was enormous. Man-hours lost to VD dropped by over 90% compared to World War I. The Germans and Japanese, lacking penicillin, continued using traditional treatments that were lengthy, toxic, and often failed. German soldiers spent months in VD treatment facilities. Japanese forces, with their rigid moral code, often denied VD treatment entirely, leading to widespread infection that degraded unit effectiveness. American military planners had understood early that keeping soldiers healthy meant keeping armies effective. They invested in penicillin production with the same strategic priority as aircraft or ammunition. The return on investment was measurable. Every wounded soldier who survived to return to duty, every infection prevented, every amputation avoided multiplied American combat power. By mid-1944, American pharmaceutical production reached levels that seemed fantastical to Axis observers. Monthly penicillin output exceeded 650 billion units, enough to treat every wounded soldier multiple times with surplus for civilian use. Quality control had standardized. Distribution networks ensured every medical unit maintained adequate supplies. Training programs taught medics and corpsmen proper administration protocols. Germany, by comparison, produced perhaps 20 to 30 kilograms of penicillin throughout the entire war, enough for several hundred treatments. Japan produced even less, perhaps 5 kilograms total. Both nations' attempts at penicillin manufacturing had failed not from scientific ignorance, but from industrial inadequacy combined with resource shortages and strategic bombing. The German pharmaceutical giant IG Farben had multiple penicillin production programs running simultaneously at facilities in Frankfurt, Leverkusen, and Höchst. None achieved meaningful output. The problems were numerous: inadequate fermentation capacity, lack of corn, steep liquor, or equivalent growth medium, insufficient electrical power for maintaining fermentation tanks, transportation difficulties, moving supplies between facilities, and Allied bombing, disrupting every stage of production. By late 1944, IG Farben engineers were reduced to growing penicillin mold in milk bottles, the same improvised method Howard Florey had used in 1940. While Americans operated fermentation tanks holding thousands of gallons, Germans were measuring output in grams from bottle cultures. The industrial disparity was total and humiliating. Japanese attempts faced even worse conditions. The Takeda Pharmaceutical Company initiated penicillin research in 1943 after obtaining information from captured Allied medical supplies. By 1945, they had produced enough penicillin to treat approximately 30 patients. The program was terminated when American B-29s firebombed the production facility in March 1945. The irony was profound. Both Germany and Japan possessed excellent pharmaceutical industries before the war. German chemical companies had pioneered synthetic drug production. Japanese pharmaceutical firms had developed sophisticated fermentation techniques. Both nations had scientists who understood penicillin's potential. But understanding wasn't enough. Production required industrial capacity, resources, organization, and most critically, the absence of strategic bombing that let facilities operate continuously. America had all these factors. Germany and Japan had none by 1944. The cumulative effect of this pharmaceutical disparity compounded throughout the war. American soldiers knew that wounds meant recovery, not death. This knowledge affected morale, combat performance, and willingness to take tactical risks. German and Japanese soldiers knew that serious wounds often meant slow death from infection. This reality created fatalism that degraded fighting effectiveness. Medical evacuation statistics revealed the difference starkly. Of American soldiers evacuated from combat for wounds, approximately 65% returned to duty after treatment. The percentage increased to 75% by 1945 as penicillin use became universal. German forces saw perhaps 40% of wounded return to duty, Japanese even less. The Americans weren't just treating soldiers better. They were maintaining combat power by keeping trained personnel alive and effective. The advantage extended to long-term recovery. American soldiers whose lives were saved by penicillin went home intact. German soldiers who survived infections often endured permanent damage from the infections themselves or from toxic treatments like mercury compounds. Japanese soldiers who survived typically did so through amputation or suffered chronic complications from untreated infections. Post-war studies would calculate that penicillin saved approximately 100,000 Allied lives in combat theaters, a conservative estimate that didn't account for reduced amputations, faster recovery times, or infections prevented entirely. The drug essentially eliminated bacterial infection as a major cause of military mortality, something no previous war had achieved. The impact on surgical practice was equally revolutionary. Surgeons could operate aggressively, knowing that post-operative infections could be controlled with antibiotics. Battlefield medicine became more sophisticated because doctors could keep patients alive long enough for complex procedures to work. Survival rates for abdominal wounds, head injuries, and severe trauma all improved dramatically once penicillin became available. By spring 1945, American military medicine had achieved something unprecedented in warfare. Wounded soldiers were more likely to survive than die, regardless of injury severity. Infection, the ancient killer that had claimed more soldiers than weapons throughout military history, had been defeated by industrial chemistry applied at massive scale. German and Japanese medical officers, observing American treatment of POWs, documented this revolution with mixture of professional admiration and national humiliation. They were witnessing medical superiority as total as America's air or naval superiority. And like those other advantages, it stemmed from industrial capacity to produce war materials, in this case pharmaceuticals, in overwhelming quantities. The lesson was clear. Modern warfare required not just better weapons, but better medicine. Not just tactical skill, but industrial logistics. Not just brave soldiers, but the pharmaceutical industry to keep them alive. America had integrated all these elements into a military system that operated at scale and tempo no other nation could match. The yellow liquid in those small vials had become as important as the bullets in American rifles. Soldiers carried it, doctors administered it, and lives were saved with routine efficiency. The miracle drug had become so commonplace that soldiers barely thought about it. But for enemy soldiers dying from infections in field hospitals without adequate supplies, and for enemy doctors watching helplessly as their patients succumbed to treatable conditions, American penicillin represented something more profound than medical advantage. It represented total industrial dominance applied to every aspect of warfare, including the capacity to keep soldiers alive long enough to continue fighting. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The converted hospital at Stalag 12A erupted in subdued celebration. Subdued because wards still held wounded soldiers, German and American, recovering under the same roof. Dr. Wilhelm Bauer stood in the doorway of Ward C and watched the 3 American soldiers he'd declared doomed 4 weeks earlier. The gangrene patient, Corporal James Mitchell, was walking with crutches, his legs saved, tissue healthy, preparing for discharge. The pneumonia case, Private David Chen, was helping distribute mail, lungs clear, fully recovered. The septicemia patient, Sergeant Robert Williams, was playing cards with German POWs, teaching them poker, alive and healthy, when he should have been dead from blood poisoning. Bauer thought of Gefreiter Heinz Müller, 19 years old, who died screaming in a German field hospital from gas gangrene, that these American soldiers had survived with routine penicillin treatment. The boy's last words, "I'm already crippled. Don't make it worse," haunted Bauer every time he watched an American soldier walk away on legs that should have been amputated. Captain Morrison appeared beside him, following his gaze. "You're thinking about your German patients." "Every day," Bauer admitted. "How many could have been saved if we'd had penicillin?" "Hundreds that I personally treated. Thousands across all German medical facilities. They died from infections that you cure as routinely as setting broken bones. That wasn't your fault. You worked with what you had." "Which was nothing." Bauer's voice was flat. "While my patients died, yours survived. Not because you were better surgeons, because you had better chemistry." Morrison lit a cigarette, offered one to Bauer. "The war's over, Doctor. Time to think about what comes next. We're going to need surgeons in Germany to help rebuild the medical system. Men like you, who've seen both sides, who understand what modern medicine requires." Bauer accepted the cigarette, considering. The Wehrmacht medical service had collapsed along with the Wehrmacht itself. German hospitals were overwhelmed, undersupplied, operating with 1940 equipment and depleted staffs. Reconstructing German medicine would require not just facilities but philosophical transformation, accepting that industrial-scale pharmaceutical production was as important as surgical skill. "Will penicillin be available for German civilians?" Bauer asked. "Eventually. Production is being ramped up for civilian use. Within a few years, it'll be available in every pharmacy. The price is dropping fast. We're down to 55 cents per dose, and it'll go lower." Your children will grow up in a world where bacterial infections are just inconvenient, not deadly. The concept was staggering. Throughout human history, infection had been the great killer. More soldiers had died from infected wounds than from weapons themselves in every war before this one. Children died from scratches that turned septic, from pneumonia, from scarlet fever. Now penicillin could cure these conditions in days. "My children," Bauer said quietly, "will never understand what it was like to watch patients die from infections I couldn't stop. They'll take antibiotics for granted, complain when recovery takes a full week instead of 3 days. They'll never know how miraculous this yellow liquid truly is." "That's progress," Morrison said. "The goal isn't to make people appreciate miracles. It's to make miracles routine." The production statistics supported Morrison's optimism. By war's end, American pharmaceutical companies had produced over 650 billion units of penicillin monthly. The manufacturing process that had seemed impossible in 1941 had become standardized, efficient, and scalable. Pfizer's Brooklyn plant alone could produce more penicillin in a day than all German facilities had managed in the entire war. The cost trajectory was equally dramatic. In 1943, penicillin cost $20 per dose, expensive but acceptable for military use. By 1945, mass production had driven the price to $0.455. By 1950, it would be $0.05. The Americans had industrialized pharmaceutical production so thoroughly that life-saving medicine would become cheaper than aspirin. The impact on military medicine was measurable in survival statistics that previous generations of military doctors would have considered impossible. Among American forces in the European theater between D-Day and German surrender, approximately 100,000 soldiers received penicillin treatment for infections that would have been fatal or required amputation without antibiotics. Conservative estimates suggested the drug saved 95% of these cases, 95,000 lives preserved through pharmaceutical intervention. The broader statistics were even more striking. Battle casualty fatality rates, the percentage of wounded who died, dropped from 8% in World War I to less than 4% in World War II. Historians would debate multiple factors for this improvement: better battlefield medicine, faster evacuation, improved surgical techniques, blood plasma transfusions. But penicillin was the single largest factor. Soldiers survived because infections that killed their fathers in 1918 could be cured in 1944. Gas gangrene, the terror of military surgeons since gunpowder was invented, had been effectively neutralized. American forces reported 1.5 cases per 1,000 wounded. German forces reported 20 to 30 per 1,000. But the true disparity was in outcomes. American gas gangrene cases recovered 85% of the time with limbs intact. German cases resulted in death or amputation over 90% of the time. Pneumonia, which had killed tens of thousands of soldiers in every previous war, had been reduced to a treatable condition. American forces lost 70 soldiers to pneumonia in the entire European theater through March 1945, compared to 17,000 American deaths from pneumonia in just 18 months during World War I. The disease hadn't become less deadly. The treatment had become infinitely more effective. But perhaps the most significant impact was on soldiers who didn't die, who kept their limbs, returned to duty, rebuilt their lives without permanent disabilities caused by infections. German military records showed that of soldiers who survived hospitalization for severe wounds, approximately 40% suffered permanent complications from infections or toxic treatments. American records showed less than 5% permanent complications among similar cases. Penicillin didn't just save lives, it saved quality of life. The German pharmaceutical industry, which had led the world in chemical synthesis and drug development before the war, faced complete reconstruction. IG Farben, the chemical giant that had attempted penicillin production, was being broken up by Allied authorities for war crimes. Its involvement in concentration camp atrocities and chemical weapons production made its survival impossible. The companies that emerged from IG Farben's dissolution would eventually become pharmaceutical leaders, but they would do so by adopting American mass production methods they had once dismissed as crude. Japan faced similar reconstruction. The Takeda Pharmaceutical Company, which had produced perhaps 5 kilograms of penicillin during the entire war, would become a major antibiotic manufacturer by the 1950s. But only by licensing American production methods and fermentation technology. Japanese pharmaceutical tradition had emphasized small-batch purity. American methods had emphasized massive-scale adequacy. The Americans had been right. The broader lesson extended beyond pharmaceuticals. The war had proven that industrial capacity could be applied to any aspect of warfare, including medicine. The side that could manufacture survival at scale would defeat the side that relied on individual skill and limited resources. This principle would shape post-war military doctrine across the world. By 1950, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and other nations had developed robust antibiotic production capabilities, all based on American methods shared during the war. Penicillin became the foundation for an entire class of antibiotics: streptomycin, chloramphenicol, tetracycline, and hundreds of others. The pharmaceutical revolution that began with Fleming's contaminated Petri dish and accelerated through American mass production created modern medicine as it exists today. The commercial impact was profound. Pharmaceutical companies that had built fermentation facilities for wartime penicillin production pivoted to civilian markets. By 1946, penicillin was available in American pharmacies. By 1950, it was globally distributed. Bacterial infections that had killed millions throughout human history became treatable with drugs costing pennies. The human cost of not having penicillin was incalculable but significant. German military medical records, captured and analyzed post-war, suggested that approximately 300,000 to 400,000 German soldiers died from infections that penicillin could have cured. Japanese records were less complete, but estimates suggested similar numbers. Combined with civilian casualties from infections during the war years, the total deaths from lack of antibiotics likely exceeded 1 million. These deaths weren't from superior Allied weapons or tactics. They were from industrial inadequacy, failure to produce pharmaceuticals at the scale modern warfare required. Germany and Japan had lost soldiers to infections they could have prevented had they possessed the industrial capacity and organizational coordination to manufacture antibiotics at American scale. The philosophical implications ran deeper than production statistics. American military culture had approached penicillin as a logistics problem requiring industrial solutions. German and Japanese cultures had approached it as a pharmaceutical challenge requiring chemical precision. The Americans had been willing to accept good enough antibiotics produced in massive quantities. The Germans and Japanese had insisted on high-purity small batches. This difference in approach reflected broader cultural attitudes toward warfare itself. Americans treated war as an industrial process requiring mass production of everything: weapons, vehicles, supplies, and medicine. Germans and Japanese treated war as requiring excellence in individual systems and reliance on superior training and tactics. The industrial approach had won decisively. Dr. Bauer remained in Germany after the war, working in Hamburg hospitals to rebuild the medical system. He never forgot his time in American medical facilities, watching routine miracles performed with industrial-scale pharmaceuticals. In 1952, he wrote an article for a German medical journal reflecting on his experiences. The Americans won the war before the first shot was fired. They won it in laboratories that discovered penicillin, in factories that produced it by the ton, and in supply systems that delivered it to every medical facility. They won through industrial capacity applied to saving lives rather than taking them. And in doing so, they revealed that modern warfare requires not just better weapons, but better medicine, not just tactical skill, but pharmaceutical logistics. I watched American doctors save soldiers I had declared doomed. I watched German POWs recover from conditions that killed German soldiers in our hospitals. And I understood that surgical skill without adequate supplies is meaningless. The Americans didn't defeat us through superior medicine. They defeated us through superior industrial organization applied to medicine. The lesson is clear. Nations that can manufacture survival at scale will defeat nations that rely on individual excellence with limited resources. This principle applies to pharmaceuticals as surely as it applies to aircraft production or tank manufacturing. The side that industrializes medicine wins the medical war. And in total war, the medical war matters as much as the shooting war. On that May afternoon in 1945, watching American soldiers walk away from infections that should have killed them, Bauer finally understood what he'd been witnessing. The yellow liquid in those small vials represented American military philosophy in its purest form. Identify a problem, apply industrial solutions, produce at overwhelming scale, and distribute with logistical efficiency. They had done it with tanks, aircraft, ships, and ammunition. They had done it with penicillin. And in doing so, they had saved more lives than any weapon could take. Gefreiter Heinz Müller had died in December 1944, killed by gas gangrene that routine penicillin treatment could have cured. Corporal James Mitchell had survived in April 1945, saved by antibiotics administered as casually as bandages. That difference, between death and survival, between a boy screaming for his mother and a soldier walking on recovered legs, was the difference American industrial capacity made when applied to medicine instead of weapons. The revolution wasn't in the chemistry. Fleming had discovered penicillin in 1929. The revolution was in the industrial mobilization that turned a laboratory curiosity into a drug produced by the billion units, distributed globally, and administered so routinely that soldiers barely thought about it. That was the American secret. Not better science, but better production. Not smarter doctors, but more supplies. Not superior individuals, but superior systems operating at scale no other nation could match. And in every field hospital where American soldiers lived instead of died, in every ward where German POWs recovered under American care, in every pharmacy where penicillin would soon be available for pennies, the proof remained. Industrial capacity applied to saving lives had proven as decisive as industrial capacity applied to war. The yellow liquid had won the war. And in winning, it had created a world where bacterial infections would never again be the great killer of human history. If this story of medical warfare revealed something you never learned in school, you're exactly where you need to be. We uncover the hidden truths of World War II, not the famous battles everyone knows, but the invisible advantages that actually determined who won and who lost. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The next story might reveal why German tank aces feared something invisible, or how Japanese admirals discovered they'd already lost by reading American production numbers, or what Soviet soldiers thought when they saw American logistics in action. The history they didn't teach you is waiting. Let's explore it together, one industrial miracle at a time.